speak to you in this rebuttal portion of our argument. We're going to discuss different topics. I want to begin by discussing the science in the case. Defense counsel issued a very appropriate and aggressive attack upon the science, but I want to take a more measured and complex approach. Science can't be understood by simplistic concepts or easy phrases. The best way to understand the science in this case is to look at it and first look at what the scientists agree on and then what they don't agree on. And basically, the way it works is it's up to you to decide with an expert, as with any other witness, what part of his testimony you believe or don't believe. And in a dispute between experts, it's up to you to decide which one you believe. And you may reject both. You may find one more credible than the other because of experience or because of just that what they said makes sense. So it's totally up to you to decide what you believe from what the experts have told you. But I think it might be helpful to start out kind of isolating these areas sort of by subject matter. The first one I'd like to start talking about is the experts you heard on the subjects of forensic anthropology and forensic pathology. Those are sort of related fields. Those are the medical examiners and the forensic pathologists, the people that looked at the remains themselves and what they told you. You essentially heard in this case from Dr. Jan Garavaglia, who is the chief medical examiner of the District 9 Medical Examiner's Office here in Orange and Osceola County. Dr. Utz, Dr. Utz was the gentleman who first took custody of the remains, who removed the duct tape and talked about that. You heard from Dr. Schultz, who is the forensic anthropologist, works out here at the University of Central Florida and is a contract consultant for the medical examiner's office here. You heard from Dr. Michael Warren, who is the director of the Pound Human Identification Laboratory at the University of Florida. And you also heard from Dr. Werner Spitz, who was the defense's expert called on that subject. Now, what do all of them agree on? Well, all of them agree that, number one, there is nothing in the bones that tells us anything. They all agree. There is no traumatic injury to the bones, there's no breaks, there's no fractures, there's no injuries, there's no nothing. Just looking at the bones, they all agree that there's nothing to tell us how Caylee Anthony died. Everyone agrees to that. The other thing they all agree about that is significant in this case is that because of the way the human body decomposes, there are two parts of the head that should not be together. That is the mandible and the skull. Dr. Spitz even said, remember he talked about when you picked up the skull, the mandible would stay on the ground. They're not connected. Once they decompose, there's nothing to keep them together. And what they all also agree about in this case is that when Caylee Anthony's body was found, the skull and the mandible were still in what they refer to as anatomical position. In other words, it was in the same position it would have been had the flesh and tendon been holding it. Where they disagree is on why that was the case. Dr. Utz, Dr. Garavaglia, Dr. Schultz, and Dr. Warren all told you that the only thing that could have kept that mandible in anatomical position is the tape. Remember, Dr. Warren told you, and he's, I would submit to you based on what you've heard, the most experienced of the four in forensic anthropology in skulls. He's told you that the only other time he has ever seen a skeletonized, fully skeletonized body with the mandible and the skull in anatomical position is in Sarajevo, in a skull of a person that was duct taped. So they have told you that in their opinion, which again, you may accept or you may reject, that that tape had to have been on that skull before she decomposed. Dr. Spitz presented you with an alternative, and I discussed that alternative with him at length. His alternative was that someone had come along at some later point for some unknown reason and reached down and picked up the skull off the ground, then picked up the mandible, took them someplace, put them back together, and duct taped them to hold them in place, and then returned them to the scene. You heard the cross-examination of Dr. Spitz about that scenario, and it is up to you to judge whether that scenario is reasonable or makes any sense at all. When I pointed out to Dr. Spitz that his scenario of the skull being returned was inconsistent with the, first of all, the deterioration of the duct tape, and second of all, most importantly, remember I asked him about, well, the person would not just have to put the skull back, they would have had to have draped pieces of hair over the skull. And remember what his response to that was? His response to that was to accuse the medical examiner personnel of doing it. And then when I showed him the photograph of the skull at the scene, undisturbed, with the hair in exactly the same place, he accused the sheriff's personnel of doing it. It is up to you to decide which of those two expert opinions you find more credible. And I submit to you, based on the evidence that you heard, that Dr. Spitz's version of events is incredible and non-credible. And I'll get to later in my remarks that it actually is also inconsistent with the very theory that the defense has been presenting to you in the other parts of their argument. We'll get to that in a little bit later. The other area that they disagreed on was the appropriateness and necessity of sawing open Kaylee's skull. Dr. Spitz told you that that it was a violation of protocol for Dr. Garibaglia not to have sawed open Kaylee's skull, and that it was, in his word, sloppy. On cross-examination, however, when challenged, even with his own book, to demonstrate where that protocol was set down, he was unable to do so. When asked if there was any protocol he was aware of dealing with skeletal remains that required such an act, he admitted there wasn't. In response to that, we called Dr. Michael Warren back again, the director of the Human Identification Laboratory, to tell you that, in fact, it is not protocol. In fact, it is contraindicated to open a skull unnecessarily, because there may be times when there may be some particular artifact that cannot be otherwise appreciated, but generally, no, skulls are not open. It is not sloppy to fail to do so. In fact, it is dangerous to open the skull, particularly in a child, because when you do that, the skull breaks, as Dr. Spitz did. Remember, I asked Dr. Spitz, you broke the skull, didn't you? And he was like, I don't remember that. And I showed him the photograph where the skull is fractured, and he didn't seem to remember. And I would submit to you that, based upon what you have heard in this case, that Dr. Spitz's claim that the autopsy was done improperly is not credible. The other issue that they disagree on is this issue of the supposed and this was sort of my